All right, today we are jumping into the book of Micah. And let me tell you, chapter 4 has one of the wildest contradictions you'll find anywhere in prophetic literature. It gives us a vision of a single city that is somehow destined for both total, absolute ruin and the most incredible ultimate glory.
Okay, so check this out. This is the puzzle we need to solve. These two verses are literally back to back. At the very end of chapter 3, Micah declares that Jerusalem is going to be turned into a heap of rubble. Then, without even taking a breath, the very next verse kicks off chapter 4 with a promise that it's going to be exalted above every other place on earth. Talk about a pivot.
So that's the big question, right? How on earth can both of these things be true for the same city? How do you reconcile these two completely opposite fates? Well, the answer isn't simple, and it takes us on this really complex journey of judgment, pain, and a pretty shocking transformation. So first things first, before we can even begin to understand the promise of glory, we have to get a handle on the problem. See, this prophecy of destruction didn't just come out of thin air. It was a verdict, a sentence handed down after a long, damning list of charges was brought against the city's leaders.
Micah, who's kind of this outsider looking in, just paints this incredibly grim picture. The whole system was rotten to the core. You had leaders driven by nothing but greed, prophets who were basically for sale. They tell you whatever you wanted to hear for the right price. The very foundations of the city were built on violence. There was, simply put, a complete lack of holiness.
And here's the key thing to get. This wasn't a warning, like, hey, you should change your ways or else. No, this was a declarative sentence. This was a statement of what was going to happen. The most sacred city, the home of the temple itself, was headed for total destruction because of all the corruption festering inside it.
And then, bam, the script completely flips. In the very next verse, the prophecy pivots hard. We go from a heap of rubble to one of the most powerful, hopeful visions of universal peace in the entire Bible. It's just breathtaking. And you can see this beautiful logic to how it all unfolds. It's like a chain reaction. First, God's mountain is lifted up, made prominent. This act creates a kind of global magnetism. And this is so important. Nations aren't conquered, they stream towards it because they want to learn. And it's that education in God's ways that completely transforms the entire world. And of course, this leads to that famous line that just perfectly captures the whole vibe of this transformation. It's a complete retooling of society. Think about it, taking the very instruments of death and violence and reforging them into tools that create life and help things grow. But it goes even deeper than just ending current wars. It's about dismantling the entire culture of warfare. The training, the planning, the very idea of preparing for conflict, it's just gone. They won't even learn how to fight anymore. And I love this part. This image brings that huge global vision of peace right down to your own backyard. It becomes deeply personal. It's a promise of total security. Not just from foreign armies, but from anything that could make you afraid. It's about being safe and secure in your own home. So we have our two destinations. Point A is a pile of rubble, and point B is this glorious world peace. But how do you get from A to B? Well, Micah is very clear that it is not a straight line. The path forward is actually a journey through some profound suffering. The prophet actually gives us these little timestamps to help us follow along. You have the last days, which is that idealized, far-off future. You have the but now, which is the grim, right-around-the-corner reality. And then you have this link in the middle, in that day, which is this period where God starts to gather his people through their suffering. It's a process, not an instant fix. And the metaphor Micah uses for this journey is, wow. He compares it to childbirth. It's agonizing. The city is literally forced out, pushed into exile in Babylon. But look at that language. This traumatic event is framed as a delivery. It's through the very pain of being kicked out that their rescue will actually begin. So this brings us to our final section, and honestly, to a pretty shocking climax. Because right when Zion seems like it's at its absolute weakest, its role in the story gets flipped on its head in a way you'd never expect. So remember that but now timestamp? We're back there, in the grim present. And nations are gathering around Zion again, but they're not coming to learn. They're coming with contempt, ready to tear the city down and gloat while they do it. But here is the incredible twist. The nations think this whole thing is their idea. They think they're acting on their own. What they don't realize is that they themselves have been gathered by a higher power for a totally different purpose. They see a city that's ripe for plunder. God sees a harvest being brought to the threshing floor for judgment.
And then comes this absolutely stunning command. Daughter Zion, the victim, the one in labor pains, remember, is told to get up and become the instrument of that judgment. She is commanded to thresh the very nations that came to destroy her.
Now, to really feel the force of this command, you gotta know what a threshing sledge was. This was not a gentle farm tool. This was a brutal instrument, a heavy board with sharp stones and bits of iron sticking out of it, designed to crush and tear and shred. It's a terrifyingly powerful metaphor for judgment. So just look at this radical transformation. The tender, delicate daughter of Zion is completely remade. She's given horns of iron and hoofs of bronze. The victim doesn't just get rescued. She becomes this unstoppable force of divine power, ready to completely turn the tables on her oppressors. And this is the provocative, challenging idea Micah leaves us wrestling with. It messes with all of our neat little categories of victim and victor, suffering and power. It forces us to ask, what does it mean when the one who has suffered the most becomes the very one to carry out justice?